Picture it. Late summer, 1588. Battered Spanish warships pushing northward through the North Sea, their hulls splintered, their sails torn, their dead already thrown into the grey water behind them. Ahead lies nothing but open ocean, hostile coastlines, and weather that no admiral could predict or control. No safe harbour is waiting. No friendly port lies within reach. The commanders know it, the sailors know it, and yet they sail on because there is simply no other direction left to go. Some of those ships would make it back to Spain. Many would not. Dozens would vanish so completely that even today, historians cannot say with certainty exactly where they sank or how many men drowned with them. The losses were catastrophic, but the mystery runs deeper than the numbers. It is not just that ships went down, it is that some went down without witnesses, without records, without a single survivor to explain what happened in those final hours when Atlantic storms closed over them and the sea swallowed everything whole. This is the story of the Spanish Armada, but not quite the version you might already know. The popular account tends to focus on a single dramatic confrontation in the English Channel, the English fireships cutting through the dark, the Spanish fleet breaking formation, the English cannons thundering. That battle matters, and we will get to it. But the real catastrophe came afterward, in the weeks and months that followed, when the retreating fleet sailed into some of the worst weather the North Atlantic could produce. The battle decided very little on its own. The storms decided everything. What makes this story so enduring and so genuinely strange is how many forces converged to destroy that fleet. Weather is the obvious villain, but it did not act alone. Navigation in the 16th century was an art built on incomplete knowledge, and the Atlantic coast of Ireland was barely charted. Political decisions made in Madrid sent men into conditions that could not be survived with the equipment available to them. Imperial ambition stretched Spain's resources past their limits, demanding that a fleet accomplish something that may never have been militarily possible. And when things began to go wrong, the failures compounded each other with brutal speed. Then consider this. 1588 was not even the end of the story. Spain tried again. In 1596, another great fleet sailed against England and ran directly into another catastrophic storm, losing ships and men before it ever reached its target. In 1597, a third armada scattered into the Atlantic, driven apart by gales. Its mission abandoned, its whereabouts uncertain for weeks. These later fleets are far less famous than the first, but they belong to the same pattern, the same recurring tragedy of imperial power meeting oceanic reality and losing. Each of these episodes left gaps in the historical record. Ships that sailed and did not return. Men listed in muster rolls who never appeared in any account of survivors. Wreck sites that went undiscovered for centuries, and some that have still never been found. The armadas did not simply fail. In a very real sense, pieces of them disappeared entirely, consumed by water and time and the inadequacy of 16th century record-keeping. What you're about to encounter is the full arc of that disappearance, the decisions that set it in motion, the battles that forced the retreat, the storms that finished what English guns could not, the coasts that wrecked those who nearly made it, and the long historical effort to account for everything that was lost. It is a story about naval warfare, but it is equally a story about what happens when the ocean refuses to cooperate with human plans. And it begins, as so many disasters do, with confidence. That confidence had a name, and it was Philip II of Spain. By the middle decades of the 16th century, he ruled the largest empire the Western world had seen since Rome. Spain controlled vast stretches of the Americas, territories across Italy, the southern Netherlands, Portugal, and its overseas possessions following a dynastic union in 1580, and trade networks that girdled the entire globe. The silver of Potosi and Zacatecas flowed across the Atlantic in annual treasure fleets, filling royal coffers with a volume of wealth that no other European monarch could dream of matching. Philip sat at the centre of all of it, a man of extraordinary patience, and extraordinary ambition, governing from the gloomy palace monastery of El Escorial with a discipline that bordered on the obsessive. He read dispatches personally. He annotated documents in the margins. He believed with genuine conviction that God had placed him on earth to defend the Catholic faith against all challengers, and by the 1580s England had become the most dangerous challenger of all. The problem with England was not simply religious, though religion was never far from the surface. Elizabeth I had steered her kingdom toward Protestantism, and Protestant England represented a direct affront to the Catholic order that Philip considered himself obligated to uphold. But the conflict ran deeper than theology. English privateers, men like Francis Drake and John Hawkins, had spent years raiding Spanish shipping and Spanish colonial ports with barely concealed official backing from the English crown. They were, depending on your perspective, either bold sea captains or pirates operating under royal protection, and their attacks on Spanish treasure fleets represented a direct financial assault on the foundations of Spanish imperial power. Drake's 1577 circumnavigation of the globe had included stops to plunder Spanish holdings along the Pacific coast of South America, a route Spain had considered safely beyond English reach. Drake's 1587 raid on Cadiz, which destroyed dozens of ships and enormous stores of supplies in the harbour itself, was so damaging that it delayed Spanish preparations by a full year. Philip called it singeing the King of Spain's beard, which captures the insult as well as the injury. There was also the Netherlands to consider. The Protestant Dutch provinces had been in open revolt against Spanish rule since the 1560s, and England had been supplying the rebels with money, volunteers, and eventually official military support under the Earl of Leicester in 1585. From Philip's perspective, England was not merely a religious rival, it was actively undermining Spanish control over one of the wealthiest and most strategically important territories in Europe. The Netherlands generated tax revenue, controlled critical ports, and sat directly across the Channel from England itself. Losing them permanently to Protestant rebels with English help was simply unacceptable. Something had to be done about Elizabeth, and Philip had concluded by the mid-1580s that diplomacy had exhausted itself as a tool. The plan that emerged was audacious in its conception and brutal in its logic. A great fleet would sail from Spain northward through the English Channel. It would not attempt to invade England directly from the sea, because the fleet commanders understood, with reasonable military clarity, that landing a fighting force directly from ships under fire was extraordinarily difficult. Instead, the fleet would serve as an escort and a shield. In the Spanish Netherlands, a battle-hardened army under the Duke of Parma, one of the finest commanders Spain possessed, had been assembled and was waiting. The fleet's job was to establish control of the Channel, long enough for Parma's forces to cross in flat-bottomed barges, land on the English coast, and march on London. The combined operation, fleet and army working in coordination across two separate theatres, was exactly the kind of complex joint manoeuvre that only a very large, very wealthy empire could attempt, and it required everything to go right in sequence. The financial burden of putting such an operation together was staggering even for Spain. The fleet that eventually sailed in 1588 comprised approximately 130 ships, carrying around 30,000 men, including sailors, soldiers, servants, priests, and administrators. Those ships required food, water, powder, shot, spare timber, rigging, medical supplies, and dozens of other categories of material just to leave port. Assembling it all took years. Philip's administrators scoured Spain, Portugal, the Mediterranean, and the Atlantic trade networks for ships of sufficient size and quality, and what they found was not always what they had hoped for. Many vessels were merchant ships hastily adapted for military purposes, their hulls better suited to carrying grain or wine than to enduring cannon fire. Others were taken from Portugal, following the union of the crowns, not always with the enthusiasm of their original owners. The purpose-built warships were formidable, but they were outnumbered within the fleet by vessels that were doing an impression of warships rather than actually being them. The administrative machinery required to coordinate all of this was itself a marvel and a burden. Officials across multiple kingdoms tracked manifests, settled disputes over contracts, negotiated with suppliers who knew they had a captive buyer, and priced accordingly. Philip's treasury was enormous by any contemporary standard, but it was not bottomless, and the Armada came at a moment when Spanish finances were already stretched. The American silver that funded the empire was real, but it came with commitments attached. Wars in the Netherlands had been grinding on for decades. Maintaining the Mediterranean fleet against the Ottomans required constant expenditure. Interest payments on loans from Genoese and German banking houses consumed a significant share of incoming revenue. The Armada was not a project that Spain could afford to fail, and yet the decision to proceed was not simply rational calculation. Philip was a man who genuinely believed that God favoured Catholic Spain, that the enterprise of England, as the Armada campaign was officially called, was a holy undertaking that divine providence would protect. His confidence was theological as much as strategic. When advisers raised doubts, when the original commander, the Marquis of Santa Cruz, died in early 1588 and had to be replaced at the last minute by the Duke of Medina Sidonia, a man who wrote honestly to Philip that he had no naval experience and begged to be excused from the appointment, Philip pressed forward anyway. Medina Sidonia was given the job regardless. The fleet would sail because Philip had decided it would sail, and because the machinery of empire had been set in motion to an extent that stopping it would have been nearly as costly as continuing. What made the decision irreversible was also what made repeated fleet losses so devastating. Spain's naval power rested on a finite pool of large ocean-going warships, experienced sailors, trained gunners, and specialist officers. These were not resources that could be quickly replenished. Building a galleon of the first rate took years and required skilled craftsmen, seasoned timber, and enormous capital investment. Training the crews who could handle such ships in deep ocean conditions took even longer. When ships were lost, the men who went down with them took irreplaceable expertise to the bottom. When ships were lost in large numbers, the damage cascaded through the entire structure of Spanish sea power in ways that ledgers and treasury accounts could not fully capture. There was also the question of what the fleets were meant to protect. Spain's empire depended on maritime trade routes, in a way that no landlocked power could fully understand. The annual treasure fleets from the Americas were the financial heartbeat of the entire imperial system. Disrupting them, even briefly, sent shockwaves through royal credit and military capacity across multiple theatres simultaneously. England could not destroy the Spanish Empire by sinking a few treasure ships, but every ship lost, every sailor drowned, every supply of powder and shot consumed and not replaced represented a drain on resources that Spain could not afford to lose indefinitely. Philip understood this. What he may not have fully understood was that sending great fleets into the Atlantic in pursuit of strategic goals that required everything to go right was a gamble he could afford to lose only so many times. In 1588, he was about to discover the cost of losing it once. The storms were still months away from gathering over the North Atlantic. Medina Sidonia's fleet was still being provisioned, its crews still assembling, its priests still offering masses for a voyage that everyone knew would either make history or become it. The confidence was real, the preparation was genuine, and none of it would be enough. The fleet that would challenge England for control of the Channel did not spring into existence fully formed. It was assembled piece by piece from ports across the Iberian Peninsula and beyond, pulled together through a combination of royal commandeering, commercial contract, and desperate improvisation. Understanding what the Armada actually was in terms of wood and rope and human bodies and barrels of biscuit is essential to understanding why it ended the way it did. The vulnerabilities that would kill men by the thousands in the waters off Ireland and Scotland were not created by storms alone. They were built into the fleet from the moment of its construction. The 130 ships that eventually cleared the Portuguese coast in the summer of 1588 were divided into squadrons according to their origin and type, and the differences between those squadrons mattered enormously, At the core of Spanish naval thinking were the great galleons, purpose-built warships of significant tonnage, with high sides, heavy armament, and the structural reinforcement needed to survive the punishment of prolonged combat. These were the ships that made the Armada look formidable on paper, the vessels that appeared in dispatches and official accounts as proof of Spanish maritime dominance. The Squadron of Portugal and the Squadron of Castile contributed most of these frontline warships, and they were genuinely impressive machines of war, heavily built, carrying dozens of guns, crewed by experienced sailors. They represented the best that Spanish naval construction could produce. But the galleons were not the whole story, or even most of it. Alongside them sailed armed merchantmen, known as urcas, hulks, that had spent their working lives carrying bulk cargo across the Atlantic or around the Baltic trade routes. These ships had been requisitioned, fitted with gun ports where their hulls permitted, loaded with soldiers and supplies, and pressed into service as fighting vessels. The problem was that converting a merchant hull into a warship was not simply a matter of bolting cannons onto the deck. Merchant ships were built for capacity and economy, not for speed or manoeuvrability, or the ability to take punishment and remain seaworthy. Their gun ports sat lower to the waterline than was ideal, which meant that in rough seas the lower batteries could not be used at all without risking flooding. Their rigging was designed for steady ocean crossings, rather than the rapid, precise manoeuvring that channel fighting would demand. They were ships wearing a soldier's armour over a civilian body, and under pressure the civilian body would show. Beyond the galleons and the armed merchantmen were the support vessels, pataches and zabras used for scouting and communication, hospital ships, and supply hulks carrying the mountains of material that 30,000 men would need to survive a campaign of uncertain duration. These smaller craft were faster and more agile, but they were also more vulnerable, and in serious weather conditions they would struggle to keep pace with the main fleet or to maintain the tight formation discipline that Spanish tactical doctrine required. The men who crewed and fought aboard this collection of vessels were nearly as varied as the ships themselves. The sailors, the gente de mar, were drawn primarily from the Iberian Peninsula and included experienced Atlantic hands alongside men whose previous experience had been limited to coastal Mediterranean trade. The distinction mattered enormously because the Channel and the Atlantic north of Finisterre were a different sailing environment from the relatively calm Mediterranean, with different wind patterns, different currents, and different consequences for navigational errors. There were soldiers in considerably larger numbers than the sailors, because the Armada's designers envisioned close-range boarding combat as the decisive form of naval engagement, a style of fighting in which Spanish tercio infantry had an established reputation for ferocity and effectiveness. Officers, many of them nobles whose qualifications were social rather than nautical, commanded at various levels of the hierarchy. Priests sailed in significant numbers because this was officially a holy enterprise, and masses were celebrated daily across the fleet. Surgeons and their assistants were present, though in numbers wholly inadequate to what the campaign would actually require. The supply situation, even before the fleet departed, was a slow-moving disaster. The preparations had already been disrupted once, badly, by Drake's 1587 raid on Cadiz, which had not only destroyed dozens of ships, but had also burned enormous quantities of seasoned barrel staves. This detail might sound trivial, but it was not. Barrels made from green, unseasoned wood shrank as the wood dried, allowing air and contamination into stores that were meant to be hermetically sealed. The water carried in poorly made barrels became foul within weeks. The salt beef and pork packed in them rotted faster than expected. The biscuit, the staple food of any early modern fleet, was supposed to remain edible for months, but was already in poor condition before many ships left port. Contemporary accounts from officers aboard the fleet describe water that smelled bad, meat that was visibly decayed, and biscuit that had gone mouldy or had been consumed by weevils. Men were eating spoiled food from the moment the voyage began, which meant they were becoming ill from the moment the voyage began, which meant that by the time the Armada reached the Channel, it was already fighting a medical crisis below decks that official reports did their best to minimize. Gunpowder presented a related problem. The quantities carried were theoretically sufficient for an extended engagement, but the quality was uneven, and storage conditions aboard ship were not ideal for maintaining powder in reliable condition. Shot, the iron balls that the guns actually fired, was available in considerable quantity, but there was a persistent mismatch between the calibers of the guns carried on different ships and the shot those ships actually had aboard, a logistical failure that would make itself felt at the worst possible moments in combat. Rigging and spare parts were carried in the support vessels, but the assumption built into the supply plan was that serious damage would be repaired in port, not at sea. There was no coherent provision for extensive at-sea repair of battle damage or storm damage, because the planners had not fully reckoned with the possibility that the fleet might find itself unable to reach any friendly port for weeks. Medical care deserves particular attention because it was, even by the standards of the time, woefully underprovided. The surgeons available to the fleet were too few, their supplies of instruments and medicines inadequate, and their ability to deal with the combination of battle wounds, disease, malnutrition, and exposure that a prolonged campaign would generate was essentially non-existent. Men who were wounded in combat could not expect effective treatment. Men who became sick from contaminated food or water would receive limited help. As the campaign extended far beyond its planned duration, the sick lists aboard every ship in the fleet grew longer, and the healthy men who remained had to handle the work of crews that were already below their established strength at departure. Haste was the thread connecting all of these failures. Philip had driven the preparations forward with a determination that overrode the objections of supply officers and harbour masters, who could see clearly that the fleet was not ready. The original departure date had already slipped repeatedly, and each delay added costs while failing to solve the underlying problems of rotten provisions, inadequate gunpowder, and uneven ship quality. There was enormous political pressure to sail before the window of campaigning weather closed entirely for the year, before the Dutch rebels could consolidate their position, before Elizabeth could further strengthen English coastal defences. So compromises were made, corners were cut, manifests were certified as complete when they were not, and ships that should have been rejected as unfit for the campaign were incorporated into the fleet anyway because there was nothing to replace them with. The result was a force that was genuinely powerful in some dimensions and seriously compromised in others, and the compromises were not visible from the outside. A fleet of 130 ships, its banners flying, its priests conducting mass on open decks as it moved northward through the Atlantic swell, looked like the expression of an empire at the height of its power. Philip's officials wrote dispatches describing it in those terms. English intelligence reports scrambled to assess its strength and came back with numbers that caused genuine alarm in London. The Armada was a real military force, capable of doing real damage, and it would prove that in the Channel. But beneath the appearance of overwhelming strength, the fleet was carrying its own destruction in the holds below the gun decks. The rotten water casks, the spoiled meat, the green timber in the hulls of ships that were already straining against North Atlantic swells in ways their designers had never intended. The soldiers crowded into spaces below decks where disease moved freely from man to man. The officers who had no experience of the waters they were about to enter. The supply plan that assumed a campaign of weeks and would face instead a campaign of months, conducted not in the English Channel as intended, but in some of the most dangerous seas in the world. The storm was still months away. The weaknesses were already aboard. The idea at the heart of the 1588 campaign was, on paper, coherent. Spain did not need to conquer England entirely, at least not immediately. What Philip required was a foothold, a bridgehead, a controlled landing of sufficient military force to compel Elizabeth's government to negotiate, to cease supporting the Dutch rebels, to stop licensing privateers to raid Spanish shipping and Spanish colonial ports. The instrument for achieving this was not the Armada acting alone. It was a conjunction, a meeting at sea between the fleet sailing from Lisbon and a second force waiting across the Channel. The Duke of Parma, Alessandro Farnese, commanded the most formidable Spanish army in Europe on the coast of the Spanish Netherlands. His forces had been fighting the Dutch for years, and he was widely regarded as the finest general in Philip's service. The plan called for the Armada to clear the Channel of English opposition, to establish naval dominance in the narrow waters between Calais and the Kent coast, and at that point Parma would embark his veterans onto shallow draught barges and cross to England under the protection of the fleet's guns. The army would do what armies do. The fleet would make it possible by controlling the sea long enough for the crossing to happen. The logic was sound as a strategic concept. The execution was another matter entirely. The problem was that Parma's barges were flat-bottomed craft designed for river and coastal movement, not for open water operations, and they were extraordinarily vulnerable to attack by the Dutch flyboats that patrolled the shallow waters off the Flemish coast. The flyboats were small, fast, heavily armed for their size, and crewed by men with an existential stake in preventing a Spanish army from reaching England, and then returning to finish the work of suppressing the Dutch revolt. They could operate in waters too shallow for the Armada's great galleons to follow. This meant there was a gap in the protection the fleet could actually provide. Parma's barges would be exposed during the most critical moments of any embarkation and crossing, and no one had found a convincing solution to this problem before the campaign began. Communication between Medina Sidonia, commanding the Armada, and Parma, commanding the army, was slow, unreliable, and conducted across water that neither side fully controlled. Dispatch boats carried messages, but the messages took days to arrive. Conditions changed faster than the correspondents could track them, and the two commanders were operating on different assumptions about what the other would be able to do when the moment arrived. Parma, in his private communications, expressed serious doubts about whether the junction could be achieved as planned. He needed a deep-water port where the Armada could anchor and provide real cover for his embarkation, and there was no such port available to him on that stretch of coast. The English and Dutch held the ports that would have served. What remained were open roadsteads where the great ships would swing at anchor, exposed to whatever the weather chose to deliver, unable to manoeuvre effectively, unable to protect the barges during the crossing. These were not small concerns raised by nervous subordinates. They were fundamental structural problems with the plan, and they were known before the fleet departed. Philip received reports describing the difficulties. His response was characteristically to insist that God would provide the resolution that human planning could not. This was not mere piety deployed as evasion, though it functioned that way. Philip genuinely believed the campaign was doing God's work and that divine intervention would supply what logistics could not. The fleet sailed with these unresolved problems built into its operational concept. The actual departure from Lisbon in late May 1588 was immediately punished by the Atlantic. Within days the fleet encountered severe weather that scattered ships, strained rigging, and opened the seams of hulls that were already imperfectly caulked. The Armada was forced into the port of Corunna in northern Spain to regroup, rewater, and repair what damage it could. The delay lasted weeks. Provisions that had already been questionable were consumed during the wait. Fresh water taken on at Corunna supplemented barrels that were continuing to contaminate their contents as the green staves shrank. Men were already falling sick in numbers that could not be quietly absorbed into the routine of fleet management. Medina Sidonia used the time at Corunna to send Philip a remarkable letter. He described the state of the fleet with unusual candour, cataloguing the problems with provisions, the sickness among the crews, the poor condition of some of the vessels, and his own doubts about whether the enterprise could succeed as conceived. He suggested that negotiations might be worth pursuing, that the risks of continuing were very great. Philip's reply was essentially an instruction to sail. The political and strategic investment in the enterprise was by this point too enormous to be unwound by a commander's expressed reservations. The fleet would proceed. The weather that had driven the fleet into Corunna was itself a signal that should have carried weight. The channel in the summer months could be navigated reliably, but the window of favourable conditions was not unlimited, and time spent in harbour was time spent burning through the campaign season. Every week of delay at Corunna was a week in which the weather over the Atlantic and around the British Isles was moving toward autumn, toward the conditions that would later become catastrophic. The Spanish commanders knew that the season was advancing. They had no way to know precisely how badly the timing would matter, but the pressure of the calendar was real and felt. When the fleet finally cleared Corunna and shaped its course northward toward the English Channel, in late July, it was already compromised in ways invisible from a distance, but deeply significant in practice. Sick lists were lengthening. Water quality was deteriorating. The men responsible for communicating the fleet's position and intentions to Parma were working with systems of contact that were entirely inadequate to the precision that the plan required. The Armada needed to arrive at a specific place, at a specific time, signal Parma, receive confirmation that his forces were embarked, and then hold position against English attack long enough for a crossing that would take many hours. The margin for error in this sequence was extremely small, and the tools available to reduce error were rudimentary. Geography added its own pressures. The channel narrows progressively as a fleet moving eastward approaches the Strait of Dover, and the narrowing means that manoeuvring space diminishes as the destination approaches. Shoals extend from both the French and English coasts. Tidal currents run powerfully through the confined water, meaning that a fleet trying to hold position was fighting both wind and tide. The anchorage off Calais, where the Armada would eventually wait for word from Parma, was exposed to just this combination of forces, offering no real protection and no ability to quickly recover from an unexpected threat. The campaign had been planned on the assumption that everything would go correctly, that the timing would hold, that communications would function, that weather would cooperate long enough for the conjunction to be achieved. By the time the Armada sighted the English coast, not one of those assumptions had survived contact with reality. The decisive battles in the Channel lay just ahead, but the expedition was already in ways that mattered enormously, losing before the first shots were fired. The Armada sighted the Lizard, the southwestern tip of Cornwall, on July 29th. English lookouts relayed the news by beacon fire, the signal chain running inland and up the coast faster than any ship could sail. The fleet that appeared on the horizon was enormous, organised into a crescent formation stretching roughly 2 miles across. Its flanks curled back to protect the slower and more vulnerable transports at its centre. It was an impressive piece of seamanship, simply to hold that formation at all across open water. It was also, as events would prove, a formation optimised for defence rather than attack, and defence alone was not going to deliver what the campaign required. The English response was immediate and aggressive. Lord Howard of Effingham commanded the fleet, with Francis Drake serving as his vice-admiral, and from the first contact the English approach was to refuse the kind of engagement the Spanish formation was designed to invite. The Armada's tactical doctrine was built around the idea of closing with enemy ships, grappling and boarding, turning a naval battle into the kind of infantry fight at sea that Spanish tercios had spent decades learning to win. The English had no intention of allowing that to happen. Their ships were faster, more manoeuvrable, and most critically their guns were designed and crewed to fight at a distance rather than as a prelude to boarding. This difference in gunnery philosophy ran deeper than simple weapon design. Spanish gunners were trained to fire a relatively small number of devastating shots at close range, then shift to the business of boarding and hand-to-hand combat. English gunners were trained to maintain a continuous rate of fire at longer ranges, working their guns as weapons in their own right, rather than as opening moves in a boarding sequence. Spanish artillery pieces on many ships were positioned and rigged in ways that made reloading them during active battle extremely difficult, and the men trained to work them were not the specialised gunnery crews the English had developed. These were not trivial distinctions. They meant that in an extended gunnery duel conducted at ranges the English chose to maintain, the Spanish ships were outgunned in terms of rate and effectiveness of fire, even when they were not obviously outgunned in terms of the raw number of cannon aboard. The fighting in the Channel unfolded across several engagements over a little more than a week, as the two fleets moved eastward together, the English harrying the Armada's flanks and rear, while the Spanish formation struggled to maintain cohesion and force a decisive closing action. Off Plymouth, off Portland Bill, off the Isle of Wight, the English attacked and withdrew, seeking to damage, to tire, to disrupt the formation without ever giving the Spanish the close engagement they needed. Medina Sidonia fought these actions with considerable skill and determination given the circumstances, holding his formation together under pressure that would have scattered lesser fleets, and managing the difficult task of coordinating movement across dozens of ships using flag signals and small dispatch vessels. But he could not change the fundamental dynamic. He could not catch ships that refused to be caught. He could not force an action that required English cooperation to happen. The English were also experiencing real frustrations of their own, a point worth holding clearly. They were firing vast quantities of ammunition and doing less damage to the Armada than the noise and fury of the engagements suggested. Spanish hulls were taking hits, men were dying, individual ships were being pushed out of formation and roughly handled. But the formation itself was surviving. The Spanish galleon San Salvador was badly damaged by an internal explosion early in the campaign, and the galleon Nuestra Senora del Rosario was disabled in a collision and captured by Drake. These were losses, but they were not catastrophic losses. After the fighting off Portland and the Isle of Wight, both sides were aware that the Channel battles had not produced a decisive result, and both sides were running critically short of gunpowder and shot. The Armada anchored in the roadstead off Calais on August 6th, in the exposed position the commanders had long feared but could not avoid. Medina Sidonia needed to communicate with Parma, needed to learn when the army would be ready to embark, needed to hold position in open water while the Dutch flyboats continued to blockade the Flemish ports, and while the English fleet assembled in his wake. The situation was precarious. It was about to become catastrophic. On the night of August 7th, the English sent fireships. 8 vessels, loaded with pitch, tar, and whatever combustible material could be packed into them, were set alight and sent drifting on the wind and tide toward the anchored Spanish fleet. Fireships were a known tactic, and the Spanish had prepared for the possibility. Pinnaces were stationed to intercept and tow them away. But these particular fireships were large. They were burning intensely, and at least some of them had loaded guns that began firing as the heat reached them. Whether from genuine fear or simple confusion in a dark night full of fire and noise, the Spanish response was not the ordered deflection the plan required. Ships cut their anchor cables to get clear, because waiting to haul in anchor in the face of fireships took time and nerve that the moment did not supply. They scattered into the dark. Losing anchors was serious in itself. But the deeper consequence was the loss of formation, the loss of the careful, disciplined crescent that had protected the fleet for the entire length of the Channel passage. When morning came and the Battle of Gravelines began on August 8th, the Armada was scattered, disorganized, and fighting off the Flemish shoals with the wind pushing it toward the shallows. The English attacked with everything they had, closing to shorter ranges than they had dared in the Channel, firing faster and more effectively into a fleet that could not hold formation because ships were still working to recover from the night's chaos. The Battle of Gravelines was the most damaging single day of fighting the Armada experienced. Multiple ships were badly hulled, their crews taking heavy casualties. Several came very close to running aground on the shoals, before the wind shifted slightly and gave the fleet sea room. The Spanish fought back with determination and courage, and the English eventually pulled back again when ammunition ran out. But the critical thing was not the specific count of ships sunk or men killed in those hours of fighting. It was the position the fleet now occupied. The Armada had failed to establish naval dominance in the Channel. It had failed to link up with Parma. It had lost cohesion at the moment it most needed discipline and coordination, and it now found itself north of the Flemish coast, with the English fleet between it and any return through the Channel. The campaign's original purpose was beyond recovery. The question facing Medina Sidonia was no longer how to deliver Parma's army to England. It was how to bring his surviving fleet home. The answer to that question would lead the Armada into the worst waters in the world at the worst possible time of year. The wind that had pushed the Armada north from Gravelines refused to cooperate with any plan that involved turning back. For several days following the battle, Medina Sidonia waited and watched, hoping for a shift that would open the Channel again and allow him to bring his damaged fleet around into more familiar waters. It did not come. The English sat to the south and west, conserving their own nearly exhausted ammunition close enough to be a continuous threat, positioned well enough to contest any serious attempt to force a southward passage. The Channel that had been difficult to traverse eastward was now effectively closed to any westward return. Geography, wind, and the English fleet had combined to remove the obvious option entirely. The decision that followed was not so much a strategic choice as a recognition of the only remaining possibility. The fleet would sail north around the top of Scotland and then south along the western coasts of Scotland and Ireland before turning east and making for the Spanish ports. The route was enormous, adding thousands of miles to what should have been a relatively straightforward homeward voyage. It passed through waters that Spanish pilots and commanders knew in the abstract but had never navigated in detail. There were almost no reliable charts for the Scottish northern coast or the Irish western shore. The Atlantic approaches to Ireland were poorly understood in terms of their currents, their rocks, and the particular brutality of the weather systems that formed over the open ocean to the northwest and came ashore with little warning. Medina Sidonia knew all of this. He ordered the course anyway, because there was nothing else to order. The fleet that began working its way northward through the North Sea in mid-August was not the fleet that had entered the Channel 3 weeks earlier. The battle damage accumulated across multiple engagements had left many ships in genuinely poor condition. Rigging had been cut by shot and hastily repaired or not repaired at all. Hulls were taking water through shot holes that carpenters had plugged with whatever materials were available. Patches that held adequately in calm conditions but would not hold indefinitely against heavy seas. Several ships had lost masts entirely or were sailing with makeshift replacements that could not bear a full spread of canvas safely. The loss of anchors during the fireship panic at Calais had been severe and fleet-wide. Many ships were carrying one anchor where they should have had several, or had improvised lighter substitutes that could not reliably hold a large vessel in strong currents or exposed anchorages. In waters where anchoring safely might be the difference between survival and shipwreck. This was not a minor problem. The supply situation had deteriorated sharply. The campaign had been planned around a relatively short operational window, and what provisions remained after weeks at sea and in active battle were running low. Fresh water was particularly critical. Water stored in wooden casks during warm summer months went bad quickly, and much of what remained was already borderline. Food was short and much of it spoiled. The horses and mules carried aboard several ships for use in the invasion campaign were consuming water and fodder the fleet could not afford to spare, and officers began ordering them thrown overboard as the northern passage began. A brutal measure that reflected how seriously the calculus of survival had already shifted. The army that had been meant to march through England was being stripped away piece by piece before it ever touched English soil. Medina Sidonia issued a general order to his commanders as the fleet moved north, laying out the route they were to follow and the precautions they were to take. It was a document that read, between its careful official lines, with the particular weight of a man who understood that he was organizing a survival operation rather than a military campaign. The instructions were precise about the course to follow, warning commanders to give the Irish coast a wide berth, keeping well to the west to avoid the rocks and the unpredictable currents that ran along that shore. The order was explicit, and the reasoning was sound. What it could not account for was what the weather would do to ships that had already been weakened past their margins. The navigational challenge facing Spanish pilots in these northern waters went beyond simple unfamiliarity with the coastline. The mathematics of latitude navigation, which Spanish pilots had refined across decades of Atlantic voyaging, worked well enough in the open ocean, but it required reliable instruments, consistent observation opportunities, and calm enough conditions to take accurate readings. In the North Sea and around northern Scotland, the weather conditions that made careful navigation possible, and the weather conditions that made it necessary, were frequently in direct opposition. Overcast skies hid the sun when pilots needed it most. Strong currents, particularly the complex flows around the northern tip of Scotland and through the channels between the Scottish Islands, set ships sideways from their intended courses without the pilots having reliable ways to measure or correct the drift. Dead reckoning, the art of estimating position from known starting points, speed and direction, accumulated errors over days and weeks that could translate to significant positional uncertainty at exactly the moments when being wrong about your position meant running onto rocks. The fleet passed the north of Scotland in late August, spread across a wide area of sea in a loose formation that bore little resemblance to the disciplined crescent of 6 weeks earlier. The passage was not uniformly terrible. Some ships made it around in reasonable order, but the dispersal itself was a problem because a scattered fleet is a fleet where individual commanders must make individual decisions without the guidance or resources that a formed group could provide. A ship that suffered a new crisis in those waters, a new mast failure, a fresh outbreak of illness devastating a crew already weakened by dysentery and malnutrition, a pumping problem overwhelming the men available to work the handles, was a ship whose commander had to solve that crisis alone. By the time the leading elements of the fleet were turning south and beginning the descent past the Outer Hebrides toward the Irish coast, the margins had narrowed considerably. These were ships that had set out in July with full provisions and healthy crews, carrying spare anchors and sound rigging, and even then the campaign had pushed them to their limits. What was left now was a fleet sailing into the open North Atlantic on failing provisions, with damaged hulls, reduced crews, missing anchors and improvised repairs, heading for a coast that the explicit orders of their commander told them to avoid, but that the weather would soon make unavoidable. The retreat had become something else entirely. It had become a race between the fleet's remaining capacity to function and the conditions that were gathering just beyond the horizon to the west, with a force and scale that no one aboard those ships yet fully understood. What was gathering beyond that western horizon was not a single storm, but a succession of them, moving in from the Atlantic with the particular relentlessness of autumn systems that build over thousands of miles of open ocean before they arrive. The North Atlantic in late August and September is not the same ocean that summer sailors navigate in calmer months. The jet stream begins its seasonal shift, deepening the low-pressure systems that roll eastward off the back of the continent, and what comes ashore on the western faces of Scotland and Ireland arrives with a fetch behind it that has encountered no obstacle since Newfoundland. The storms that struck the Armada's remnants were not freakish or historically unprecedented. They were, by the standards of that coast, almost ordinary. That was precisely the problem. The weather patterns the fleet encountered as it descended south along the Atlantic face of Ireland were driven by a series of deep Atlantic lows that meteorologists working backward from historical records centuries later have been able to partially reconstruct. The pattern was one of recurring westerly gales interrupted by brief intervals, calm enough to encourage hope, but not long enough to allow genuine recovery or repositioning. A ship caught in these conditions faced a rhythm of punishment. The wind would ease slightly, crews would work frantically to repair what they could, bail what needed bailing, assess damage, and try to calculate position, and then the next system would arrive and the battering would begin again. Each cycle left the ship a little worse off than before. Each interval was shorter than the one before it, not because the weather was objectively worsening in sequence, but because the ship's capacity to handle the same conditions was eroding with each passing day. Prevailing winds along the Irish coast in this period ran predominantly from the southwest and west, which meant that any ship attempting to hold a course clear of the shore was fighting into the wind just to maintain its distance. A healthy ship with full rigging and an experienced crew could claw offshore in these conditions with difficulty. The ships descending past Ireland in September of 1588 were not healthy ships with full rigging. Many had lost the ability to work effectively to windward at all. Damaged masts could not carry the press of canvas that beating into the wind required. Hulls that were taking water needed the pumps worked continuously, which consumed men who were needed everywhere else. A ship that cannot move efficiently to windward in the presence of a westerly gale and a lee shore is not in a navigational predicament. It is in a terminal one. The wind and the current together become a conveyor, and the shore at the end of it is not a destination. It is a conclusion. The currents along the Irish coast compounded the wind's work in ways that contemporary pilots had almost no reliable means to account for. The Atlantic approaches to Ireland are complicated by the interaction of the main oceanic circulation with the shallowing of the continental shelf and the irregular geometry of the coastline itself. Currents that ran predictably offshore could set unpredictably inshore once they encountered headlands, bays, and the complex tidal flows that characterise the western Irish coast. A pilot taking his best estimate of position from dead reckoning over several days of overcast skies and variable winds could believe himself to be 10 or 15 miles clear of a hazardous headland and be significantly wrong, with the current having been setting him eastward the entire time he was calculating his safety margin. The coast did not announce itself until it was too close for a damaged ship to respond to. Early modern seamanship was not without skill or sophistication. Spanish pilots in particular had accumulated remarkable practical knowledge across decades of transatlantic navigation. The pilots who guided treasure fleets across the Atlantic and back had developed real expertise in reading weather, interpreting cloud formations, sensing shifts in swell patterns, and using biological indicators like seabird behavior and watercolor to infer proximity to land. None of this knowledge was useless in the waters off Ireland, but all of it operated within limits that the conditions of late 1588 repeatedly exceeded. Barometric pressure measurement did not exist as a practical tool. There was no way to know how deep a storm system was, how fast it was moving, or how long it would persist. A commander deciding whether to seek shelter, whether to attempt to anchor, whether to run before the wind or try to hold position, was making that decision on incomplete information under conditions where the consequences of a wrong guess were immediate and irreversible. Anchoring, the option that could have bought time and distance from a dangerous shore, had been compromised fleet-wide at Calais. A ship that arrives at a potentially sheltering anchorage with one light anchor, or none at all, cannot anchor safely in any meaningful swell or tidal current. The lost anchors were not a single decisive factor, but a thread running through every account of ships in trouble off Ireland. Again and again, commanders who might otherwise have had an option found that the option had been taken from them 6 weeks earlier, in a panicked flight from fireships in a Flemish roadstead. The loss cascaded forward in time and expressed itself at the worst possible moment on a coast where holding ground was the only alternative to being driven onto it. What the environment was doing, in the weeks after the fleet turned south past Scotland, was applying a series of compounding stresses to systems that were already past their design tolerances. A hull is built to handle sea conditions within a certain range. Rigging is designed to carry sail up to certain wind speeds. A crew can manage the demands placed on it as long as enough men remain healthy and rested enough to function. Each of these tolerances had been degrading since the fleet left Lisbon in May, and degrading faster since the fighting in the Channel. The storms did not need to be catastrophic by Atlantic standards to be catastrophic for these ships. They simply needed to be ordinary Atlantic autumn weather, arriving regularly, applied to hulls and crews and rigging that had already absorbed everything they could absorb, and were surviving on margin that was, by September, effectively gone. The result was not a single disaster, but a cumulative collapse distributed across time and space, playing out over weeks along hundreds of miles of coastline. Ships that had survived the Channel battles, survived the North Sea Passage, survived the rounding of Scotland, arrived at the Irish coast not as a fleet, but as individual struggling vessels, each one isolated by weather and distance from every other, each one making its own increasingly desperate calculations about whether it could hold off the shore one more day, whether the anchor would hold if it could find holding ground, whether the crew had enough left in them to keep the pumps going, whether the next lull would come before the hull gave way. For ship after ship, the answer arrived not as a decision but as a fact, sudden and final, when the keel touched rock and the sea came in. The keel touching rock was not an ending. It was a transition into a different kind of catastrophe, one that played out not in open water, but on beaches, cliffs, bogs, and the doorsteps of a society wholly unprepared to absorb what the Atlantic was delivering to it. The wrecks did not cluster randomly along the Irish coast. They concentrated in predictable zones where geography conspired most effectively against ships approaching from the northwest. Sligo Bay and its surrounding headlands collected several vessels, among them the La Juliana, the Santa Maria de Vison, and the Lavia, which drove ashore together at Stredag Strand in late September. Estimates suggest that more than 1,000 men drowned there in a single night, their bodies left in rows along the waterline. Further south, the coast of Connacht, Clare Island, Clew Bay, the broken shoreline of Mayo, claimed additional ships as they tried and failed to find shelter in bays that offered less protection than they appeared to promise from seaward. Down along the west coast of Clare and Kerry, more ships struck, some driven hard onto rock platforms where the sea disassembled them in hours, others settling onto sandbars where men survived long enough to see shore without ever reaching it. The total number of ships lost along the Irish coast has never been established with certainty. Contemporary accounts and subsequent scholarship suggest somewhere between 20 and 24 vessels, though the accounting remains incomplete because some ships vanished without witnesses capable of leaving records that survived. When a ship struck, the manner of striking largely determined who lived and who did not. A vessel driven broadside onto a sandbar in a heavy swell would be rolled and pounded until it broke apart, and men attempting to swim ashore in that surf faced odds that were effectively nil. The Atlantic swell off the Irish coast is not a gentle thing even in mild conditions. In the storms of September and October 1588, it was a mechanism for destroying anything it could move, and men in the water were among the things it could move. Those who drowned did so quickly in most cases, which was among the more merciful outcomes available. Those who reached shallow water often found themselves unable to stand in the surge, dragged back by the undertow, battered against submerged rocks, or simply too exhausted after days or weeks of deprivation to fight the last 100 yards of surf. The shore that had been the object of desperate navigation for hundreds of miles became its own final obstacle. Those who made it ashore alive entered a world that was strange to them in almost every dimension. They were, in many cases, southern Europeans with limited experience of this climate, speaking no Irish and often no English, arriving naked or nearly so after the sea had stripped them, starving after weeks on reduced rations, and physically wrecked by illness and exposure. They landed on a coast that was itself in a condition of complicated political stress, caught between the authority of the English crown and the older structures of Gaelic lordship that still operated with considerable autonomy in the west of Ireland. The response of local communities to these survivors was not uniform, and it could not have been, because the pressures acting on those communities were not uniform. In areas under effective Gaelic lordship, some lords extended genuine protection and assistance. Sorley boy MacDonnell in Ulster had personal and political reasons to resist English authority, and was not inclined to hand over men whom that authority wanted dead. In parts of Connacht, Gaelic chiefs calculated their own survival alongside any sympathy they felt for the survivors, sometimes sheltering men at considerable personal risk, and sometimes delivering them up to avoid the consequences of being found harbouring Spanish soldiers. The position of these lords was genuinely dangerous. The English administration under Sir William Fitzwilliam had made it explicit that harbouring Armada survivors was a treasonous act, and the consequences it threatened were not rhetorical. Fitzwilliam's response to the wrecks represented the English administrative panic at its most brutal. The fear was coherent from an English strategic standpoint. Thousands of experienced Spanish soldiers arriving on the western shore of Ireland, in territory where Gaelic resistance to Crown authority was already a persistent problem, represented a potential for alliance and reinforcement that the Dublin administration could not accept. The surviving men were therefore not to be treated as shipwreck victims, but neutralised as rapidly as possible. Orders went out to the provincial governors, and their subordinates instructing that prisoners of rank might be detained for ransom, but that ordinary soldiers were to be executed. The orders were followed with varying enthusiasm and competence, but they were followed. Small groups of survivors who had made it ashore and been taken in by local people were hunted down and killed. Larger groups that tried to organise for survival were dispersed and slaughtered. The confusion on land deepened the disaster in ways that pure weather and sea could not. A survivor who had made it ashore and found a local community willing to shelter him faced a situation where that community's willingness could change overnight as the political wind shifted. Men who believed they had found safety discovered they were being held while negotiations over their fate proceeded above them. The language barrier was total for most, which meant that even basic information, where they were, what was happening, whether the person standing over them meant to help or harm, was often impossible to obtain. Some survivors spent weeks or months moving between different forms of precarious shelter, before being either rescued and transported out of Ireland or eventually captured and killed. A small number managed the extraordinary journey to Scotland, or were smuggled onto ships and returned to Spain. These were the exceptional cases. The overwhelming majority of men who came ashore alive were dead within weeks. There were individual stories within this catastrophe that cut through the statistical scale of it. Captain Francisco de Quilla survived the Stridagh wreck and left a remarkable account of the months he spent hiding in the bogs and forests of Connacht and Ulster, dependent on the charity of Gaelic communities, hunted intermittently by English forces, watching companions die of exposure and disease, and ultimately making his way to Scotland and eventually back to Spain. His account is one of the few that renders the human experience of the Irish coast in any detail, and what it conveys above everything else is the particular texture of chaos, a landscape that was neither reliably hostile nor reliably safe, where survival depended on reading people and situations accurately without the linguistic tools to read them at all, and where fortune was distributed with the same arbitrary violence as the storms themselves. What the Irish coast received in the autumn of 1588 was not an invasion and not simply a shipwreck. It was something the existing categories struggled to contain: the final dispersal of a broken fleet into a society that had no framework for what was arriving, presided over by an administration that responded to confusion with systematic killing. The sea had done most of the work. The land finished it. When the final accounting came, it arrived not as a single announcement, but as a slow accumulation of silence, ships that never returned, men whose names appeared on no subsequent muster, letters that were never written home. Spain had sent somewhere between 130 and 132 ships northward into the Atlantic Passage around Britain. Fewer than 70 returned. The ships that did not come back carried with them an estimated 18,000 to 20,000 men: sailors, soldiers, gunners, servants, surgeons, priests, and the administrative machinery of an imperial military expedition. The numbers are contested and always have been, because the records were incomplete before the fleet sailed, and became more incomplete as the disaster unfolded. But no serious estimate reduces the human loss to anything less than catastrophic. The death toll from the 138 Armada, taken as a whole campaign rather than a single battle, is measured in the thousands upon thousands. It is one of the largest single losses of life in 16th century European military history, and the majority of those deaths came not from cannon fire, but from the slow violence of the return. Disease had been killing men before any storm hit. The Armada had spent weeks at sea before reaching English waters, then lingered in the Channel in conditions that were ideal for the spread of illness through crowded, poorly ventilated hulls. Dysentery was endemic. Scurvy had begun appearing in men who had been at sea longest. By the time the fleet turned north after the Battle of Gravelines, medical resources were already exhausted, and the sick were simply lying among the healthy, which accelerated the spread of infection through ships that had no capacity to isolate anyone. When storms then prevented the fleet from making landfall, men who might have recovered on land died instead in the holds, their bodies sometimes remaining aboard for days before anyone had the strength or the inclination to put them over the side. Accounts from the ships that did return to Spanish ports describe vessels arriving with the majority of their crews dead or dying, with the surviving sailors too weak to bring the ships properly into harbour, with the holds carrying the smell of illness and death accumulated over months at sea. For those who drowned off Ireland and Scotland, death came more abruptly but no less terribly. The conditions in which these men went into the water, exhausted, starving, many already sick, wearing heavy clothing and armour, plunged into water temperatures that would kill an unprotected person within an hour, meant that swimming ashore was largely a theoretical possibility. The men who drowned at Stredag Strand, at least 1,000 of them in a single night, according to the accounts that survived, would have been carried along the surf line and pounded against whatever the beach offered until they stopped moving. The bodies lay in rows. Francisco de Cuellar, who survived that same beach, described walking among the dead and recognizing officers he had known. The scale of it was beyond ordinary human comprehension, and the witnesses who left accounts struggled to find language proportionate to what they had seen. Those who survived the water entered suffering of a different kind. Exposure on the Irish coast in late September and October was its own slow death sentence for men already weakened by weeks at sea. The climate offered cold rain, wind and ground conditions, bogs, rocky hillsides, sudden fogs, that made movement exhausting even for men in good health. For men who had come ashore with nothing, who were barefoot on terrain that punished every step, whose bodies had no reserves of warmth or nutrition to draw on, exposure killed steadily and without drama. De Cuellar's account describes hiding in marshes for days at a time, unable to light fires, eating whatever he could find in the ground or beg from passing strangers. He describes companions dying beside him of cold, simply becoming still during the night. Starvation worked alongside exposure, because men arriving on a subsistence coast in late autumn, in an area already under political stress, could not count on finding food in any quantity. Rank did not save lives from the sea, but it shaped almost everything that came after. Officers and men of clear noble standing were more likely to be taken prisoner rather than killed outright, because they represented ransom value. The English administration's orders distinguished between men of quality and ordinary soldiers, and that distinction was applied with enough consistency to make nobility a form of protection, precarious and unreliable, but real. Common soldiers and sailors had no such insurance. They were killed when found, often in groups, often by people who had initially offered them food or shelter, and then faced pressure from English authorities. The Irish lords and village communities who harboured survivors did so, knowing that execution awaited the men they hid, and potentially serious consequences awaited themselves. The ordinary Armada sailor who came ashore on the Irish coast was in a position where the only difference between life and death was the immediate calculation of whoever found him first. The eyewitness accounts that survived reveal something important about how the human mind processed mass death in conditions of total institutional breakdown. De Cuellar's letter, written after his eventual return to Spain, moves between extraordinary precision and a kind of stunned incomprehension. He records specific details, how many bodies, what they were wearing, who he spoke to through gesture, alongside passages that simply stop and acknowledge that no description is adequate. He describes watching men he had sailed with for months die from causes they could not have anticipated when they left Lisbon, in a country none of them had ever expected to see, and the account conveys the particular loneliness of dying far from everything familiar without anyone present who understood your language or your name. The total cost of the 1588 campaign, when measured across all causes of death, battle, storm, drowning, disease, exposure, starvation, execution, represents something that contemporary Spain grappled with only partially. The losses were too large and too distributed to absorb as a single coherent event. Men died off the Hebrides, in the Atlantic approaches to Ireland, on Irish beaches in English captivity, in Spanish harbours after returning to port too sick to recover. Families across Spain, Portugal, and the Spanish Netherlands waited for men who never came home and often received no definitive word about what had happened. The administrative machinery for accounting for the dead was simply overwhelmed. What this section of the story resists is reduction to the famous image of the defeated fleet. The fleet's defeat in the Channel was militarily real but comparatively limited in human cost. The vast majority of those who died in 1588 died on the return voyage, in conditions that had nothing to do with English naval gunnery, and everything to do with weather, geography, disease, and the brutal logic of what happens to large numbers of desperate men when the institutions that organise them stop functioning. The Armada's human story is not primarily the story of a battle. It is the story of a slow catastrophe, distributed across hundreds of miles of ocean and coastline, that most of those who experienced it did not survive to describe. The slow catastrophe that killed so many men across so many places left behind another kind of problem, one that has occupied historians ever since. Not just the question of what happened, but the question of how we could ever know. The 1588 Armada is among the most studied naval disasters in history, and yet fundamental questions about it remain genuinely unanswered. Ships are unaccounted for. Casualty figures vary by thousands depending on which source you consult. Stories circulate that cannot be confirmed or dismissed. The vanishing was not only physical, it was archival, institutional, and deliberate, shaped by the limits of record-keeping, the chaos of catastrophe, and the active pressure of governments that needed the story to mean certain things. Early modern naval administration was not designed to survive the kind of failure the Armada represented. The bureaucratic machinery that organised a fleet of 130-odd ships, the muster rolls, the cargo manifests, the pay records, the dispatch logs, was distributed across the fleet itself. Documents travelled on ships. When ships sank, documents went with them. When ships scattered, the records they carried scattered too, arriving in different ports at different times, sometimes in the hands of survivors who had more pressing concerns than the orderly preservation of administrative paperwork. The Spanish Crown's effort to reconstruct what had happened after the fleet returned, or failed to return, was therefore working from a partial and badly damaged archive from the very beginning. Investigators sent to interview survivors encountered men who were sick, traumatized, sometimes incoherent, frequently motivated to present their own conduct in the most favourable light. What came back to Madrid was already a filtered and incomplete version of events. Storms compounded the record-keeping problem in ways that went beyond simply sinking ships. A fleet that dispersed in severe weather lost the capacity to account for itself. Captains who survived a storm and made port had no reliable way to know what had happened to the ships they had last seen through rain and darkness. Reports filed in Spanish ports through September and October of 1588 are full of phrases that translate roughly to last seen before the storm parted us and believed lost but not confirmed. The uncertainty was real and immediate, not a later historical problem. Men at the time genuinely did not know which ships had gone down, and which might still be struggling somewhere toward land. Some vessels arrived weeks after they were presumed lost. A few may have made landfall in places no one expected, leaving no report at all. This uncertainty created the conditions in which rumour flourished, and rumours about the Armada's missing ships have never entirely stopped. Stories of ghost ships drifting crewless into Atlantic waters circulated within years of the disaster, tales of treasure ships wrecked on unknown coasts, their gold still lying underwater or buried by survivors who never returned to claim it, became part of the folklore attached to the event almost immediately. Some of these stories are impossible to evaluate because they were never recorded in any form that allows cross-referencing. They exist as oral traditions or as marginalia in documents concerned with entirely different matters. Others are specific enough to have attracted serious investigation, including underwater archaeology, without producing definitive conclusions. The difficulty is that the line between a story that preserves a genuine historical memory and a story that is pure invention is not always visible from the outside, especially when the underlying records are so fragmentary. Several ships that departed with the Armada cannot be conclusively traced to any confirmed fate. They are not listed among the confirmed wrecks. They are not among the ships documented as returning to Spain. They appear in the outbound muster and then disappear from the record entirely. This does not necessarily mean they sank in unknown locations. It may mean the records of their fate simply did not survive, but it leaves genuine gaps that allow speculation to fill the space where documentation should be. Historians working with the surviving archive have done enormous work in narrowing these gaps, but they have not closed them entirely, and some probably cannot be closed with currently available evidence. Both Spain and England had powerful reasons to shape what the surviving story said, and both exercised that influence actively. England wanted the Armada's defeat to be total, providential, and permanent, evidence of divine favour and English naval superiority. The propaganda generated by Elizabeth's government emphasised the storm's role as an act of God, celebrated in the famous medal struck to commemorate the victory, with its inscription describing the winds that blew and scattered the enemy. This framing was politically useful and theologically satisfying, but it also obscured the extent to which English naval action had been decisive before the storms even arrived, and it reduced a complex military and logistical failure to a single divine verdict. Spain had its own distortions to introduce. Philip II's government could not afford to present the disaster as a comprehensive failure of Spanish planning, seamanship, or strategy. The storms became an explanation that preserved Spanish honour. The fleet had not been defeated so much as overtaken by forces beyond human control. Both versions contained elements of truth, and both versions left things out that complicated the preferred narrative. What historians can say with genuine confidence is actually substantial. The fleet departed, fought in the Channel, failed to accomplish its strategic objective of linking with Parma's army, sailed the northern route home, and lost a large fraction of its ships and men to storms off Scotland and Ireland. The broad shape of the campaign is well documented. The locations of more than 24 wrecks have been established through documentary evidence, archaeology, or both. The general scale of the human loss, catastrophic, running to many thousands of deaths, is not seriously in dispute, even if the precise figure cannot be fixed. The political consequences for Spain, for England, and for the subsequent trajectory of European naval competition are traceable through the decades that followed. What cannot be known with confidence is more specific and more personal. The exact fate of individual ships that vanished without leaving documentation. The precise number of men who drowned as opposed to dying of disease or exposure. Whether any vessels made landfall in locations that never generated a surviving record. The full contents of dispatches and reports that went down with their ships. The names of men who died on Irish beaches and were recorded by no one. This is the nature of historical catastrophe. The event is real and the evidence is real, but the evidence is always partial, always shaped by who survived to create it and what they needed it to say. The Armada vanished in ways that were literal, ships going beneath cold water, and in ways that were administrative, political, and finally legendary. What remains is a story assembled from the fragments that chance, survival, and selective preservation made available, always with gaps where certainty runs out and something else, inference, rumour, or myth, steps in to fill the silence. The gaps and silences in the historical record might suggest that the 1588 disaster simply froze Spain in place, that Philip II absorbed the catastrophe, retreated from ambition, and accepted the new shape of the world the storms had made. The opposite was true. Within years of the Armada's destruction, Spain was rebuilding, reconsidering, and planning again. The impulse that had sent 130 ships into the Channel did not die with those ships. It persisted, stubborn and expensive, through the 1590s and into the next reign. To understand what the 1588 disaster actually meant for Spanish power, you have to follow it into its sequels, and the first and most revealing of those sequels came in 1596. Spain's recovery from 1588 was slower and more painful than Philip II's government publicly acknowledged. But it was real. The silver flowing from the Americas continued to fund military ambitions on a scale no other European power could match. New ships were commissioned. Experienced officers who had survived the first Armada were placed in command of refitted squadrons. The strategic logic that had motivated the original campaign, breaking English support for Dutch rebels, ending English interference in the Atlantic, re-establishing Habsburg dominance over the sea lanes, had not changed. If anything, it had intensified. English raids on Spanish ports and shipping had continued through the late 1580s and early 1590s, most humiliatingly in the 1587 attack on Cadiz, and again in 1596, when an Anglo-Dutch fleet struck Cadiz a second time, burning ships and plundering the port before Spanish forces could mount an effective response. The 1596 raid was not simply an embarrassment. It destroyed ships, disrupted trade, and demonstrated that Spain's maritime defences remained dangerously inadequate. The pressure to respond was enormous. The Armada, assembled in the summer and autumn of 1596, was therefore shaped by urgency as much as strategy. Its goals were specific and operationally focused in a way the 1588 campaign, with its complex joint operation requirements and its dependence on Parma's army, had not been. The 1596 fleet was aimed at Ireland, specifically at the southwest coast, where Spanish planners had correctly identified a population that was actively resisting English rule, and where a Spanish landing force could potentially establish a permanent presence, threatening England from a direction that would be much harder to counter than an attack across the Channel. The logic was sound. Ireland was genuinely vulnerable from a Spanish perspective. English control over the island was contested and incomplete. Local lords had already made contact with Spanish agents, signalling willingness to cooperate if a real army arrived with real supplies. A Spanish bridgehead in Ireland would stretch English resources and potentially unravel the entire strategic situation in the North Atlantic. The fleet assembled for this purpose was substantial. Estimates vary, but something in the range of 100 ships carrying soldiers and supplies for an invasion force. It was not comparable in raw size to the 1588 Armada, but it was a serious military expedition organised with lessons from the earlier disaster at least partially absorbed. The logistical planning was more coherent. The objectives were clearer. The commanders had more realistic expectations about what coordination with hostile Irish terrain would require. Philip II, aging and in declining health, pressed for the expedition with the urgency of a man who understood he was running out of time to change the strategic landscape before he died. The fleet departed from Lisbon in October 1596. Then the weather arrived. The timing was critical, and the consequences were severe. October was already a dangerous month for major naval operations in Atlantic waters, a fact the 1588 disaster had demonstrated with terrible force just 8 years earlier. The fleet ran into heavy storms almost immediately after leaving port, and the storms did not relent. Ships were scattered. Some were damaged badly enough that they could not continue. The expedition that was supposed to reach Ireland and establish a military presence never got there. The fleet turned back, or rather was driven back, arriving in Spanish ports in disorder, its fighting capacity consumed by weather before any fighting had occurred. The comparison with 1588 is instructive and in some ways more damning for Spain than the original disaster. In 1588, the storms had struck a fleet that had already fought a Channel campaign and attempted the planned operation, at least partially. The storms found the fleet exhausted, damaged, and sailing into unfamiliar waters on an emergency route chosen under duress. The 1588 catastrophe was a combination of strategic failure, tactical reversal, and meteorological disaster layered on top of one another. The 1596 failure was simpler and in certain ways starker. The storms encountered a fleet that had not yet engaged anyone, that carried everything it needed for the campaign, and that was simply unable to function in the Atlantic conditions of October. No battles had been lost. No tactical mistakes had been made. The weather alone was enough. This exposes something important about the structural problems embedded in Spanish naval planning throughout the period. The ambition was consistently large. The resources devoted to preparation were genuinely impressive by the standards of the era. But the relationship between operational timing and Atlantic weather was never adequately solved. The window during which large fleets could move reliably through Atlantic and Channel waters was narrow, and the requirements of assembling, provisioning and coordinating expeditions of this scale meant that fleets repeatedly departed late, entered dangerous seasons, and encountered conditions that their ships and rigging were not built to survive. The Armada of 1588 had been delayed repeatedly before it even left Iberian waters. The 1596 fleet left in October. The pattern of temporal miscalculation persisted across both attempts, suggesting that the problem was not individual poor judgment but systemic, built into the administrative machinery and the political pressures that governed how expeditions were planned. There was also the question of what had been learned and what had not. Spanish shipbuilding had improved after 1588. Some tactical and logistical lessons had been absorbed, but the fundamental vulnerability to storm damage that had contributed to the 1588 disaster, ships that were heavily built for carrying capacity rather than for weathering severe Atlantic conditions, rigging that could not handle extreme conditions, navigation practices that left little margin for the unexpected. These problems had not been solved in 8 years, and they were not solved in 1596. The storms found the same weaknesses they had found before. The 1596 failure left Spain strategically unchanged. Ireland remained unconquered. English naval pressure continued. The resources consumed by the expedition, ships, provisions, men lost to exposure and storm damage, were simply gone, added to the long account of what the Atlantic had taken from Philip II's ambitions. The king himself died the following year, having spent his reign launching 3 armadas toward England and watching weather dismantle 2 of them before they reached their objectives. What he had built was enormous. What the storms undid was enormous too. And the 3rd attempt was already being organised, even as the 1596 fleet was limping home. The 3rd attempt came faster than anyone outside the Spanish planning machinery might have expected. Philip II was dying, but dying slowly, and the strategic imperative had not changed. English support for Dutch rebels continued. The raids on Spanish shipping and ports had not stopped. Ireland remained the most promising point of pressure, a place where Spanish forces, if they could actually land and hold ground, would force England into a costly 2-front problem. The 1596 failure had been humiliating, but it had not destroyed the fleet. Many of the ships that had turned back from October storms had survived intact, and the logic of the Irish strategy still held. So within months of the previous expedition's collapse, Spain was organising again. The 1597 Armada, sometimes called the Islands Voyage in English accounts, though that term properly refers to the corresponding English operation that year, was assembled with renewed urgency and, on paper, represented a serious military force. The fleet was commanded by Martín de Padilla, the Adelantado of Castile, a high-ranking figure whose appointment signalled how much prestige the crown was investing in another attempt. The objectives were largely the same as 1596. Reach the Irish coast, establish a landing force in a region where local resistance to English rule was already active, and create a strategic problem for England that could not be ignored or easily resolved. Spanish planners also maintained secondary ambitions involving the interception of English shipping and the possibility of striking at English ports if conditions allowed. The strategic vision was ambitious, multi-layered, and dependent on the fleet actually arriving. The problems began before the fleet even cleared Spanish waters. Assembling a large expedition required coordinating ships, troops, provisions, and equipment across multiple ports, and the machinery for doing this was never as smooth as plans assumed. Delays accumulated. Arguments over command, provisioning, and the sequencing of departure consumed time that nobody had to spare. When the fleet finally put to sea in the autumn of 1597, it was once again entering the Atlantic at a point in the calendar when the weather was already turning hostile. This was the same fundamental timing failure that had contributed to the 1596 disaster and, further back, had compounded the difficulties of the 1588 campaign. The administrative and political pressures that drove Spanish expedition planning consistently produced departures late enough in the season to court disaster, and 1597 was no exception. The storms found the fleet with particular severity. What had been a coherent force of somewhere between 100 and 140 ships was broken apart by weather with a thoroughness that made tactical response almost meaningless. Ships were driven in different directions depending on where they were in the formation. When the worst conditions hit, which squadrons managed to hold together, and which commanders made the call to run before the wind rather than attempt to fight through it? Some vessels were pushed far to the north, well beyond any reasonable course for Ireland. Others were driven west, out into the deeper Atlantic, away from any coast and into waters where their supplies and structural integrity were tested beyond their limits. A significant number suffered damage serious enough to force an immediate return to Spanish ports, not as a strategic decision but as an emergency measure to avoid sinking. The breakdown of command cohesion under these conditions was almost total. This was not primarily a failure of individual officers. It was a consequence of the communication technology available to 16th century fleets. Once a storm of sufficient severity hit a large formation, the ability to issue orders, coordinate movements, or even know where other ships were became essentially non-existent. Signal flags were useless in heavy weather. Small boats that might carry messages between ships were impossible to operate safely. Each captain was reduced to making individual decisions about survival based on his own judgment, his ship's condition, and whatever local knowledge he possessed. The Adelantado himself could not reform his fleet under these conditions because he had no mechanism for doing so. He could not locate ships that had been separated from the main body, could not assess how many had been lost versus merely scattered, and could not communicate any revised plan, even if he had formulated one. The fleet that had departed as a coordinated military force became, under storm conditions, a collection of individual vessels, each navigating their own crisis. The trickle of returns that followed told the story in fragments. Ships came back to Spanish ports over a period of weeks, arriving at different times and in varying states of damage. Some had been driven so far off course that they had genuinely uncertain accounts of where they had been. Some carried sick and dying men, the result of exposure during extended storm conditions. The process of accounting for what had happened, how many ships were lost outright, how many had turned back early, how many were still at sea, was slow and incomplete, and the numbers that emerged were contested even at the time. This kind of dispersal was exactly what fed the larger legend of armadas simply vanishing. Ships went out, storms came, and the return was partial, staggered, and full of gaps that rumour and uncertainty filled with their own content. The ships that actually reached Ireland were a small fraction of what had departed. The landing that was supposed to threaten English strategic interests never materialised on anything like the intended scale. Whatever contact was made with Irish chieftains or coastlines was brief and strategically inconsequential. The campaign that had been designed to change the balance of power in the North Atlantic dissolved into weather before it could accomplish anything at all. What the 1597 failure reinforced above everything else was the image of the ocean itself as an active force against Spanish ambition, not neutral terrain to be crossed, but a hostile environment that repeatedly and specifically dismantled the most expensive and carefully organised military efforts Spain could produce. 3 armadas in 10 years, 2 of them broken by storms before they reached their objectives. The third, the original campaign of 1588, defeated by a combination of tactical failure and catastrophic weather on the return. The pattern was damning and inescapable. Spain could build fleets. Spain could fund expeditions at a scale no other power in Europe could match. But the Atlantic and the Channel approaches to England seemed to reject these expeditions with a consistency that made strategic analysis almost secondary to meteorological fact. The 1597 dispersal was in some ways the purest expression of this pattern. A fleet scattered not by fighting, not by strategic error, not by the failure of Allied coordination, but simply by the ocean doing what it did in autumn. The ambition was consumed by weather, and the fleet returned in pieces, its campaign unfinished, its objectives unreached, adding another chapter to a story of disappearing armadas that Spain's enemies would tell for generations, and that the historical record would preserve as one of the defining images of the era. The scattered ships of 1597 left behind what all the armadas ultimately left behind: silence, uncertainty, and the sea. But unlike the documents, the rumours and the contested casualty figures, the seabed keeps its evidence in a different form. Over the past several decades, archaeologists and marine surveyors have begun to recover that evidence piece by piece, and what they have found challenges, confirms, and sometimes completely rewrites what the written record thought it knew. The most significant wreck discoveries linked to the 1588 disaster came largely through surveys conducted along the Irish coast, beginning in the 1960s, with systematic work accelerating in the following decades. The sites identified near Streidarg Strand in County Sligo, at Lacada Point off the Giant's Causeway in County Antrim, and at various locations along the coasts of Clare and Donegal, represent some of the most archaeologically important Spanish shipwreck sites in the world. The Lacada Point site is particularly well documented. This is where the wreck of La Girona was identified, and subsequently excavated under the direction of Robert Stainwhite in 1967 and 1968. La Girona was a galleass, a hybrid vessel combining oar and sail propulsion, and she went down carrying not only her own crew but survivors from at least 2 other ships, making her final manifest a condensed record of Armada catastrophe. The recovery from Lacada Point included gold jewellery, coins, navigational instruments, and personal objects belonging to officers and noblemen who had sailed from Lisbon in May 1588 and never returned. These objects, now held at the Ulster Museum in Belfast, represent one of the most immediate and human connections to the disaster that archaeology has produced. What the physical remains reveal goes well beyond the sentimental. Cannons recovered from Armada wreck sites have proven particularly revealing because they document something the written record addressed, but struggled to quantify: the mixture of gun types and calibers that reduced the effectiveness of the Spanish fleet during the Channel fighting. Bronze guns cast to consistent specifications sit alongside iron pieces of varying quality and age, exactly what contemporaneous accounts suggested about a fleet that had assembled its armament from multiple sources across multiple years. Measuring the bore diameters and composition of recovered guns gives archaeologists a material record of the logistical compromises that went into arming the fleet, and that record is consistent with English accounts describing Spanish gunnery as slower, less coordinated, and operating under greater constraint than their opponents. Ballast stones tell a different kind of story. These are unglamorous objects, river cobbles, quarried stone, but their geological signatures can often be traced to specific regions of origin. When ballast from a wreck site can be sourced to a particular river valley or quarry in Portugal or southwestern Spain, it adds a data point to the ship's biography, suggesting where it was built, where it was fitted out, or where it was last loaded before departure. Hull remains where they survive, provide information about construction techniques, the types of timber used, and the condition of the vessel at the time of wrecking. Some wrecks have produced evidence of hasty repairs and stressed structural elements, consistent with ships that had already endured the Channel Campaign and the brutal passage around Scotland before meeting their final end on the Irish coast. Personal objects are the most immediately affecting category of find, but they are also analytically valuable. Rings, medallions, rosary beads, navigational dividers, and coins recovered from wreck sites allow archaeologists to trace the social composition of crews and passengers. La Girona's excavation recovered items belonging to men of significant rank, alongside items that were clearly the possessions of ordinary sailors and soldiers. The distribution of objects across a site can reflect the dynamics of the wreck event itself, where passengers congregated, which parts of the ship broke apart first, how the debris field was shaped by current and seabed topography over the following centuries. Identifying wrecks conclusively is, however, genuinely difficult, and the challenges increase with each century of submersion. Wood rots, iron corrodes, and the identifiers that might seem obvious, a ship's bell with a name, a captain's log sealed in an improbable container, almost never survive. In practice, attribution relies on assembling circumstantial cases from multiple lines of evidence. The presence of Spanish artifacts, the dating of coins to before 1588, the type and configuration of ordnance, the geological origin of ballast, the location relative to known wreck accounts from Irish chronicles or English administrative records, all of these threads are woven together to produce an identification that is confident but rarely absolute. Several sites that were initially associated with Armada ships have been reconsidered as evidence accumulated and interpretations shifted. The archaeology does not simply confirm the written record, it frequently forces the written record to be re-examined. One important case involves the lists of ships known to have been lost and the question of where they actually went down. Contemporary Spanish and English sources produced figures for losses that were estimates at best and propaganda at worst. English accounts had reasons to overstate the devastation. Spanish accounts had reasons to obscure it. When wreck archaeology locates a site in a position inconsistent with the recorded drift of a particular vessel, or produces material evidence suggesting a different ship type than the sources describe, it creates productive complications. These complications matter because they push historians toward more precise reasoning about what the written record was actually recording. Official intelligence, rumour, bureaucratic accounting, rather than treating documentary sources as straightforward factual accounts. The most sobering finding from decades of maritime archaeology on Armada sites is how incomplete the picture remains. Modern survey technology, multi-beam sonar, sub-bottom profilers, remotely operated vehicles has transformed the search capacity available to researchers. Yet significant numbers of ships known to have wrecked on Irish and Scottish coasts have not been located in any form that allows identification. The sea floor is not a stable archive. Strong tidal currents, sandy seabeds that shift, biological degradation, and the abrasive action of storm surges over 4 centuries have destroyed some wrecks entirely or reduced them to a scatter of corroded material indistinguishable from natural seabed features. Some ships may have broken up so completely on the rocks that no coherent deposit ever formed. Others may rest in locations that have not yet been surveyed at adequate resolution, waiting for technology or funding that does not yet exist. This permanent incompleteness is itself a finding of significance. The archaeology confirms that the scale of the disaster was real, that the material record of these fleets is recoverable in fragments, and that those fragments carry genuine information about ships, men, and events. But it also confirms that the ocean is a destructive archive that does not preserve everything equally or consistently. The armadas that vanished into storms left behind physical traces, but those traces are partial by nature, enough to verify the catastrophe, not enough to resolve every question the catastrophe raised. The wreckage and the silence exist together, which is perhaps the most honest account the seabed can offer of what happened to the fleets that never came home. The fragments recovered from those Irish seabeds are remarkable, but they represent only the physical dimension of what the storms took. The deeper damage, and the more contested legacy, was measured in gold, in political credibility, in the recalibration of how European powers thought about sea power and the risks of projecting it across open ocean. Understanding what the Armada disasters actually destroyed requires separating what happened from what people at the time, and since, chose to believe happened. For Spain, the military and financial consequences of 1588 were serious but not immediately catastrophic in the way the English would later insist. Philip II lost somewhere between 60 and 70 ships across the campaign and its chaotic aftermath, along with thousands of experienced sailors and soldiers. The treasure required to build, equip and provision that fleet represented an enormous expenditure from a treasury already stretched by simultaneous commitments in the Netherlands, the Mediterranean, and across the Atlantic Empire. Reconstructing equivalent naval capacity took years and absorbed resources that Spain could ill afford to redirect. Yet Philip responded not with paralysis, but with a determined rebuilding program. The armadas of 1596 and 1597 demonstrate that Spain retained the institutional capacity and the financial reach to attempt the same strategic objective within a decade of the supposed annihilation. The infrastructure of Iberian maritime power, the shipyards, the administrative networks, the trained officer corps survived 1588 damaged but not broken. The symbolic damage, however, was harder to repair. Philip had framed the enterprise as a religiously sanctioned campaign, blessed by the papacy, justified by England's Protestant apostasy and its support for Dutch rebellion. When the fleet scattered before a storm, the theological implications were genuinely awkward. Spanish commentators worked to manage the narrative. The fleet had not been defeated, it had been tested by God, a distinction that provided comfort but did not fully dissolve the embarrassment. The portrait of Philip receiving the news with stoic acceptance, supposedly responding that he had sent his ships against men, not against storms and winds, became a piece of legend that tried to transform failure into dignity. Whether he actually said it matters less than why the story circulated so persistently. Spain needed a framework that acknowledged disaster without conceding divine abandonment, and the image of the king accepting God's inscrutable will provided that framework. England's transformation of the same events followed the opposite logic. Survival became a myth of providential election. The storms that destroyed Spanish ships were not random meteorological events but evidence of divine protection, extended to Protestant England against Catholic tyranny. The medals struck in England after 1588 carried the inscription that translates roughly as God blew, and they were scattered, a deliberate theological claim that the weather itself had been a weapon in England's defence. Elizabeth's famous speech at Tilbury, whatever its actual content and timing, became a set piece in a national narrative about an island people whose faith and character had turned back a superpower. This mythology was politically useful and extraordinarily durable. It embedded the Armada into English identity as proof of a special providential relationship between the nation and its god, and it inflated the scale of what England had actually accomplished during the Channel fighting, which had been tactically inconclusive, into a civilization-saving triumph. The limits of this interpretation are significant. 1588 did not end Spanish power. It did not even decisively shift the balance of Atlantic competition. Spain continued to dominate the Caribbean and South American trade routes. English attempts to exploit the supposed weakness of their enemy. The Portugal expedition of 1589, Drake's Caribbean raids, Essex's expedition to Cadiz in 1596 produced mixed results at enormous expense. The war between England and Spain dragged on until 1604, 15 years after the Armada, and ended not in English victory, but in a negotiated peace that left Spain's imperial position substantially intact. The idea that the storms of 1588 shattered Spanish hegemony and inaugurated an age of English maritime supremacy is a retrospective construction, that flattens a much more complicated and contested century of competition. England would not become a genuinely dominant naval power until well into the 17th century, after decades of further institutional development, commercial expansion, and brutal internal conflict. What 1588 did change, more tangibly, was how naval planners across Europe began to think about the relationship between logistics, weather, and operational risk. The Armada campaign exposed specific vulnerabilities that thinking commanders could not ignore. A fleet assembled from disparate sources, different ship types, different gun calibers, different national traditions of construction and seamanship, could not fight as a coherent unit against an enemy operating from familiar home waters with a more uniform and better suited vessel design. The English race-built galleons, lower, faster, and configured to fight at longer ranges with heavier broadsides, had demonstrated tactical advantages that Spanish commanders had struggled to counter even before the storms intervened. The lesson that purpose-built warships outperformed converted merchant vessels and mixed origin assemblies was not entirely new, but the Armada campaign illustrated it at scale and with consequences that registered across Europe. The logistics question was equally instructive. Provisioning a fleet for a campaign of uncertain duration against an enemy who could refuse decisive engagement and shelter in friendly ports placed insupportable strain on supply chains that 16th century states were barely capable of managing even under favourable conditions. Food rotted, water casks leaked, and crews weakened before the main engagement was ever joined. The 1596 and 1597 armadas suffered from the same structural problems because the underlying logistical capacity had not fundamentally improved. Later naval powers, the Dutch, and eventually the English in their more systematic 17th century naval expansion, invested heavily in creating dedicated victualling infrastructure, standardized ship designs, and administrative systems capable of supporting fleets on extended operations. The Armada disasters did not directly cause these developments, but they provided a vivid negative example that informed the reasoning of those who came after. Fleet coordination emerged as a third area of lasting significance. The Armada's command structure had placed a soldier rather than a sailor in overall command, a choice that created friction between strategic intention and nautical reality throughout the campaign. The relationship between Medina Sidonia's fleet and Parma's army, which required a precise and fragile coordination across a hostile strait under enemy interdiction, had never been workable given the means available. Later campaigns would grapple repeatedly with the problem of joint operations between naval and land forces, and the Armada experience became a reference point for understanding how communication failures and mismatched assumptions between commanders could doom an enterprise, regardless of the quality of the individual components. Placed within the longer story of European maritime competition, the Armada disasters are neither the decisive turning point that English mythology requires, nor the irrelevant setback that Spanish apologists preferred. They sit in the middle of a century-long contest for Atlantic dominance that no single storm season could resolve. What the weather destroyed was real: ships, men, treasure, and a particular strategic ambition. What it did not destroy was the underlying capacity of a major European power to contest the ocean, or the fundamental dynamics of rivalry and competition that would continue reshaping the Atlantic world for another century. The storms were catastrophic and consequential, but the sea does not settle history, it only interrupts it. There is a particular kind of story that history refuses to release, not because the facts remain hidden, but because the imagination finds something in the mystery that documented truth cannot fully satisfy. The Armada is one of those stories. Historians have recovered the logs, counted the ships, mapped the wrecks, traced the survivors, and corrected the exaggerations on both sides. And yet the story persists in something beyond the archive, lodged in folklore and popular memory, and the persistent image of great ships disappearing into Atlantic darkness, never to return. Understanding why requires stepping back from the historical record and asking a different question. Not what happened, but what people needed the story to mean. The answer is different depending on which shore you stand on. For England, the Armada became a foundation myth almost immediately, and foundation myths do not age the way ordinary history does. They get polished. The storms became divine intervention, the sea itself a guardian of English liberty, and the whole episode crystallized into a story about a small Protestant nation holding off the greatest empire in the world through faith and seamanship and providential favour. That story was too useful to be complicated by nuance. It explained England to itself in a moment of genuine anxiety, and then continued explaining England to itself for centuries afterward, resurfacing whenever the country needed to invoke a particular idea of its own character, isolated, defiant, sea-protected, chosen. The legend travelled well. It absorbed new contexts without losing its essential shape, and by the time of later national emergencies, the Armada had become a permanent piece of the emotional vocabulary, a ready metaphor for survival against overwhelming odds. For Ireland, the story entered folklore through a completely different door. Along the western coasts, the wrecked Armada ships left behind not a myth of triumph, but something stranger and more intimate. Tales of dark-haired strangers washed ashore, of gold coins found in the sand, of men who arrived from the sea and never left. Some of these stories can be tested against records and found to have real origins. Others are almost certainly accumulations of older folklore attached to the Armada as a convenient historical anchor. The distinction barely matters for how they function in local memory. The drowned Spanish sailors became a kind of supernatural presence along that coastline, absorbed into a tradition of stories about the sea giving and taking, about the foreignness of those who come in from the ocean. In certain communities, the Armada dead were not simply historical casualties, but recurring figures in the landscape of memory, attached to place names, to physical landmarks, to a sense that the coast itself held something unreturned. The appeal of vanished ships and unrecovered treasure operates at a level that pure historical documentation cannot reach. There is something about the image of wealth at the bottom of the sea, gold and silver and bronze cannon lying in the dark off Sligo or Donegal, that captures the imagination precisely because it remains inaccessible. The treasure of the Armada wrecks became the subject of salvage attempts, legal disputes, national claims, and amateur obsession, long before modern archaeology brought rigorous methodology to those sites. The ships that went down carried real wealth, pay chests, personal valuables, the armaments of a major military campaign, and the knowledge that some of it remains on the seabed sustains a particular romantic fantasy about discovery and loss. The wreck is a kind of frozen moment, a ship caught in the instant of disaster and preserved in the cold dark, and that image exerts a pull that history books, however accurate, struggle to replicate. The legend, though, consistently flatters the disaster in ways the documented reality does not. The men who drowned in those storms and off those rocks were not romantic casualties of a grand and doomed enterprise. They died of exposure, of exhaustion, of violence administered by people who found them too dangerous or too expensive to keep alive. They died on beaches where no one came to help, from infected wounds in places that had no resources to treat them, from starvation during the long weeks of sailing through storms that gave no relief. The survivors who made it back to Spain were frequently ruined, sick, impoverished, their reputations damaged by association with failure. The families of the dead received no systematic notification, no formal accounting. Men simply did not return, and the absence was the only news. The gap between the legend of the lost Armada and the reality of its human cost is significant, and it is worth insisting on, because the romance of the vanished fleet has a way of abstracting those deaths into something picturesque when they were in fact merely terrible. And yet mystery survives even when historians resolve the major questions. The total number of dead will never be precisely established. The fate of certain ships remains unclear. The distribution of survivors across Ireland and Scotland left gaps in the record that contemporary chaos made inevitable. Some men who reached land vanished into local populations, their identities swallowed by circumstances that left no documentation. This residual uncertainty is not the kind that future discoveries will necessarily close. It is structural, built into the nature of events that overwhelmed the record-keeping capacity of everyone involved. And it provides genuine space for the legend to continue breathing, because the legend does not require the resolution of every detail. It requires only that some things remain unknown, some ships remain unaccounted for, some men remain missing in the way that men lost at sea are missing, without a grave, without a final location, swallowed by something too large to fully recover. There is also something more abstract at work, something about the scale of what was attempted and how completely the sea refused it. The Armada represented the full weight of the most powerful empire in the world, directed at a single strategic objective, and the ocean simply took it apart. That disproportion between the ambition and the outcome, between the preparation and the disaster, produces the particular kind of story that feels like it must mean something, that the failure must be legible as more than bad weather and inadequate logistics. The human mind resists pure contingency at that scale. We want the storm to have been a judgment or a sign or a lesson. We want the drowned sailors to be evidence of something beyond the random cruelty of an Atlantic autumn. The legend fills that interpretive space with meaning that the historical record in its proper honesty declines to provide. What the historiography has accomplished, across centuries of increasingly rigorous scholarship, is the replacement of a myth with a reality that is in many ways more interesting. The documented story of strategic miscalculation, command dysfunction, logistical failure, and meteorological catastrophe compounded by political decision-making on multiple sides is more complex and more instructive than the simple narrative of divine winds and Protestant deliverance. And it is precisely because that documented story is now reasonably well understood that we can see clearly what the legend has always been doing, not preserving the past, but using it. Using it to explain national identity, to make sense of survival, to give meaning to mass death, to keep alive the romance of something lost in the water and not yet fully found. The Armada did not simply vanish. It was destroyed by a combination of human failure and natural force, piece by piece, across weeks of storm and wreck and desperate landfall. But the image of vanishing, of ships sailing over the horizon and not returning, has proved more durable than the details. It is that image, finally, that the story carries forward. 3 fleets sailed from Spain with the full authority of empire behind them. They left harbours crowded with onlookers, their decks loaded with soldiers and weapons, and the material confidence of the greatest military power in the world. And one by one, across nearly a decade, they returned as wreckage, rumour and silence. That pattern, repeated not once but 3 times, is the defining fact of this story, and it demands a final accounting. The 1588 disaster was not the product of any single failure. It was the convergence of everything that could go wrong, arriving in sequence and then simultaneously. The strategic plan required coordination between a fleet at sea and an army on shore that the technology of the age could not reliably achieve. The ships themselves were built or adapted for carrying troops and cargo, not for the kind of aggressive naval combat that the English forced upon them in the Channel. The commanders operated under orders too rigid to accommodate the reality they encountered. The supply chain had already been stressed before the fleet left Lisbon, with food and water in casks that rotted faster than expected, and the campaign's delays before departure compounded every logistical vulnerability. When the English fireships broke the anchorage at Gravelines, and the army that was supposed to board never materialized, the Armada had no remaining option that led to success. Only the retreat remained, and the retreat led north into the worst Atlantic autumn in living memory. The storms did not act alone. They finished a fleet that combat, poor logistics, and strategic failure had already compromised. Ships that were undamaged and well provisioned might have survived what the Armada encountered off Scotland and Ireland. These ships were neither. They were leaking from gunfire, running short of food and water, manned by exhausted and sick crews and navigated by pilots who had no charts for the waters they were crossing. The storm found them vulnerable and exploited every weakness: the Irish coast, which might under different circumstances have offered shelter, instead offered a lee shore with no safe harbour and no political structure capable of providing refuge. The men who made it to land found themselves in a country that was simultaneously under English military authority and undergoing its own violent upheaval, with neither the resources nor the freedom to help them. The sea and the land conspired together against survival. Then Spain tried again. The 1596 Armada assembled with genuine strategic purpose. England was stretched. The moment seemed opportune, the fleet was well equipped, and a storm off Cape Finisterre destroyed it before it ever reached contested waters. No English fleet, no battle, no decision made by any commander on either side, just weather, arriving before the campaign could begin. And then 1597, another attempt, another fleet, another Atlantic storm that scattered the ships across hundreds of miles of ocean and sent them back to Spain in pieces. 3 attempts. 3 catastrophes defined by the sea's indifference to the intentions of the most powerful empire in the Atlantic world. What remains unknown is itself part of the story, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. The precise death toll across all 3 failures has never been established and probably never will be. Certain ships remain unaccounted for in the records, their final positions unknown, their crews untraced. Some men who reached the Irish or Scottish coast disappeared into local populations, or died in circumstances that no one recorded systematically. The gaps are not the result of careless history. They are structural, produced by events that overwhelmed every system of documentation that existed. The missing details are genuinely missing, not merely undiscovered, and that residual uncertainty is inseparable from the texture of the story itself. But the uncertainty should not obscure the clarity of the central lesson. Across 3 armadas, and nearly a decade of effort, Spain learned what the ocean teaches at enormous cost. That naval power, however massive, cannot be projected across the North Atlantic by brute accumulation of ships and men. That weather, current, and coast impose conditions on military ambition that no amount of preparation fully neutralizes. That fleets assembled with imperial certainty can be reduced to flotsam by forces no admiral commands. England grasped this, not because English sailors were braver or English ships superior in every respect, but because England understood the sea it was defending in a way that Spain, operating at the edge of its logistical range, could not fully replicate. The fleets that left Spain never truly came back. Some ships returned broken and half-crewed. Some men survived, ruined and sick. But the enterprise itself, the plan, the confidence, the certainty that imperial will could master the Atlantic and land an army on English soil that never returned. It was not defeated by England alone. It was taken apart by weather and water and the accumulated weight of everything that goes wrong when ambition exceeds what the sea is willing to permit. The Armada vanished into the storm, and the storm kept it